Okay, we'll get started soon. All right, it's about 5 past the hour, so we're going to get started. My name is Mary Kay Severino. I'm the Education Director at ARISA Lab, and I co-lead the Eclipse Soundscapes project alongside Dr. Henry Trey Winter, who's the Chief Scientist at ARISA Lab. And he is also here, but in the chat and Q&A, he and I will both be answering questions to the best of our ability, but I'm sure most of the questions will be left until the end because today's topic is on Eclipse Soundscapes preliminary results, and the best person to answer most of those questions is the speaker, who is a soundscapes expert, Dr. Brent Pease, and he is joining us today. So we're very excited. So please hold your questions that you want to ask out loud until the end. If you do have questions that you want to ask as soon as you have them, we might read them at the end. We probably won't have the answers immediately, but you can certainly drop them in the Q&A section. So ideally put them there and not in the chat. That will make it much easier for us to find them and answer them and check them off after they've been answered. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that Brent can share his.
Great. Thank you, Mary Kay. Let me get mine pulled up. And then, let's see, I think I want this. Okay, I need to do, I think, one thing because I do have a small video in my PowerPoint, and I'm pretty sure I have to do a special setting. And I wonder if Mary Kay can remind me how to play that video when I'm sharing. And it's okay if you can't, Mary Kay. You seem like you might have that answer.
Before you get started, you might want to reshare because when you do your initial sharing, you have to make sure to share with audio.
Share with audio. Okay. Thank you all for bearing with me. Okay, I'm gonna press share. Oh, I see. I see. I think I see a link over there. So I want to do share sound and optimize for video sharing, maybe?
Yes, that
But
sounds right.
it doesn't look like it's going to let me select those boxes. So it's not that big of a deal.
I'll work on
Uh,
that as you get started and we'll see if we can sort that out.
okay. I suppose you can see my screen just fine. And we're off and running. Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here. And of course, thank you to Mary Kay and Trey for including me on this presentation today. I'm always excited to share the research we are doing on Eclipse Soundscapes with as many people as we can. So I'm going to show you some preliminary results from the work we've been doing. Our team has been working on this for some time. And as you'll find out today, if you're on the call and you collected data, you all collected a lot of data, and it takes a long time to process all of it. So we're making progress and we're learning some interesting things, particularly about how birds respond to eclipses during a total eclipse. So first, I just want to acknowledge the co-authors on this talk and this work that we're doing. Again, I've been introduced. I'm Brent Pease. I'm an assistant professor in the forestry program at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. I work closely with a good friend and colleague, Neil Gilbert. Neil is at Oklahoma State. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Integrative Biology at Oklahoma State. And of course, we are teamed up with the ARISA Lab, Mary Kay and Trey. So that is our group of folks working on this project. And another thing, of course, that many of you might be aware of is that ARISA and the Eclipse Soundscapes project is a NASA grantee, and they're supported by a NASA award in this project. And I must say that anything I say today over the next webinar, of course, any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations I say are those of myself and the co-authors and not necessarily reflect the views of NASA. I hear I might have a wide audience on the call today. And if I do, that's great. But I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page when I'm going to be talking about a solar eclipse today. So what I'm hoping when I had this slide in my mind was that there was going to be a bunch of students or even maybe kids on the call who are like raising their hand right now in their classroom, say, oh, I know, I know, I know. But since I can't see you doing that, I'm going to kind of have to do a bit of a spoiler alert. But of course, a solar eclipse happens when the moon moves in front of the sun and blocks some or all of its light from reaching Earth. And it's kind of like the moon casting a big shadow on Earth during the day. And it can kind of make the sky look darker, almost like it's nighttime, but maybe just for a really short period of time. So it can result in this big change in the amount of light happening. So perhaps it sometimes maybe looks like this, where we can kind of just see part of the sun being blocked out. Or if you were in the United States and in a really special place last year around this time, you might have experienced more of a total solar eclipse on April 8th. But there are, of course, a few varieties that you might encounter whenever you're experiencing an eclipse. And today I'm mostly going to be talking about the effects of a total solar eclipse. So that on the right where the moon is completely blocking the sun, though we are working on analysis of the annular eclipse, which you can kind of see there in the middle. And though it varies though it varies from eclipse to eclipse, the annular eclipse that happened most recently in October of 2023 blocked about 90% of the sun. So again, mostly just focused on the total solar eclipse, but there are several varieties of eclipses and they're all unique in their own way. But one thing that I would say is common to any type of eclipse that might be happening is people are usually always interested in how wildlife respond during a solar, or excuse me, yeah, during an eclipse. Um, so in fact, people have been interested in this for a long, long time. There's this really, really cool paper. So if you have like 30 minutes or an hour, there's this really cool paper that came out almost about 90 years ago, and it's called Observations of the Behavior of Animals During the Total Solar Eclipse of August 31, 1932. So this is a research article that was published 90 years ago, and it basically has pulled together all these observations of what people experienced during an eclipse almost 100 years ago. And what's cool about this is that it's one of the very few comprehensive reports that we have on how all wildlife, birds, insects, mammals responded during the eclipse. And how it came to be was there was a group of researchers at the Boston Society of Natural History, and they called themselves the Eclipse Behavioral Committee. And they sent out a call through the newspapers and newsletters, and they said, please help us learn about the eclipse on August 31, 1932. So they did a call to the people to report how wildlife responded during this eclipse, and then send those reports in. And we will pull it all together and we will tell the world about how wildlife respond. So if you weren't around on August 31, 1932, or you're unaware of this particular eclipse, it passed through northeastern United States. So you see I have a little pin dropped there on Boston, just to give you a reference of where this went through. And the dark shades of red indicates, well, the dark shades near that dotted line indicate the path of totality. So that is where 100% of the sun was covered by the moon. And then the lighter in shades outside of that path kind of show different levels of coverage. So Boston was really, really close to 100% coverage. It was about 90, almost just under 100%. Places like Portland, Maine, they were 100%. And way down low, you can't really see it very well, but behind that legend bar down in North Carolina, they were about 80% coverage. So this eclipse certainly was in a populated area. It covered a lot of big cities. So lots and lots of people could, in fact, probably be around to report what wildlife did during this particular eclipse. And lots of reports they did receive. So here on this slide, this is a picture that came in that that research article I told you about. And it says, these are the locations from where we received reports during this eclipse. So all of those dots, this is a really old looking map, but all of those dots are where people were during the eclipse. And as for a frame of reference, all inside of these two orange bars, orange lines, that was the path of totality. That was where the total eclipse was occurring. So you can see they had lots of observations within the path and lots of observations without the path. So that's something that I think is really great. You get to learn about within and outside of the path. So all in all, there were about 435 reports. And I want to tell you about some of the things that the people reported during this total eclipse. So here's one quote from the paper. Hundreds of small birds, which I had not previously seen, flew about like mad things, seeking trees and bushes as places of concealment. Another quote within this same exact research article said, a report by Mr. Araujo says, in several places, birds flew against houses. And then others, I think, were a little bit more simpler, a little bit more straightforward. And one report said, a nightingale was heard. So this is kind of exactly what happens in this paper. All throughout this research article, they are just quoting these reports that they received from the people to describe how wildlife responded. So it was a very much an observational study. People were just going out and observing in nature how wildlife were responding. And this was a really important paper, and I'll tell you why it was really important. But first, kind of just in general, for a long, long time, there have been reports of wildlife responses to eclipses. One of the earliest records is from 1544, a really, really long time ago. And in general, what happens is that species that are usually awake during the day typically quiet down, and nocturnal species, so species that are most active at night, typically start to exhibit their normal activity, as if they expect that it is going into nighttime. So what this all means that is that the sun is a really, really, or just daily light is a really, really important driver for animal behavior. The daylight and the nighttime are important for the circadian rhythms, the animal's daily activity in many, many wildlife groups. But I think that this paper from the 1932 study was really important because it did three great things. It served as a recorded starting point. We need to know about this. How were things 100 years ago? Or we just need to have a good frame of reference. How do wildlife respond at some point in time? So then if we keep studying this type of project or type of research question, we can start to understand how maybe the responses have changed over time. I think another thing that was really important about this project was that it was all about doing science together. There were several projects that happened in the early 1900s that were doing science together. That is, trained researchers with the public working together to solve a research question or a science question. And though they weren't calling it anything specific back in the day, today we know this as terms like citizen science or community science or participatory science. So it was all about doing science together. And as I just mentioned with a few examples, they described how eclipses change how wildlife behave. So this was important work, but it was primarily anecdotal observation. It was people sending in reports from what they observed and experienced during their eclipse. And a lot has changed in almost 100 years. We've had many, many technological advances, and the world has changed in 100 years. So today we get to talk about a really fantastic project that you get to learn about some of the nuances, some of the small ways that wildlife behavior changes when we pull together this science together to study the effect of eclipses on wildlife. And of course, that project that I want to tell you about is why you're on this call is the Eclipse Soundscapes project. So if you are on this call and you didn't participate in the Eclipse Soundscapes project, this next slide is my great video that may or may not work because I'm not quite sure if this works on Zoom.
I'm not hearing the audio, but others
Mm,
might be.
no audio, Mary Kay?
No, maybe the audio is coming through your headset.
Um, I
Sure.
have a hand raised. I don't know. Maybe I'm guessing that you couldn't hear it. This is the thing I was trying to figure out. I have to press a very specific button on Zoom, and I just didn't know what that button was. So I apologize. But that video you can find it on the Eclipse Soundscapes website, eclipsesoundscapes.org, and it describes this general project, how we're trying to understand how wildlife respond to solar eclipses, all through, or total eclipses, all through sound. And Eclipse Soundscapes was focused on two particular events. They were focused on the 2023 annular eclipse and the 2024 total eclipse. So, of course, annular eclipses are a very special type of solar eclipses I already told you about. The moon is centered in front of the sun, but it doesn't completely obscure it. It's not completely covered. So it's often called this ring of fire, where we have this visible sunlight all around the moon. And again, it's about 90% coverage compared to a total eclipse, which of course is 100%, 100% coverage. So the 2023 annular eclipse, which occurred on October 14th, went mostly through Western United States. It was up in the Oregon and the Pacific Northwest and down, of course, through the Southwestern United States. And we contrast that with the 2024 total solar eclipse, which maybe many of you participated in this particular project for, which occurred on April 8th, 2024. And even though you can't see it, and maybe you're unfamiliar with Southern Illinois University, we were right on the path of totality. So it passed through Southern Illinois, where I am right now. So we got to have a really exciting day here in Southern Illinois. So we have these two big eclipse paths going through the United States. We're interested in this question of how do eclipses affect life on Earth? And we want to study this through sound. And the question, of course, is how do we get all those observations from this large geographic area that we want to sample, just like the Wheeler study did up in the Northeastern United States? And of course, we did it all through the power of the people, just like the Wheeler study. And there were many roles in Eclipse Soundscapes where you could participate in this project to help describe how wildlife responded to eclipses. And one of those roles was called a data collector. So you got to go out with this little thing, a little sound recorder called an AudioMoth. And here's a picture of an AudioMoth on the bottom of the screen. And if you've never held one of these before, it is fits in the palm of your hand. It's about 2 inches by 3 inches. It has 3 AA batteries on the backhand side, and there's an onboard memory card to store the sound recording files, and it will listen whenever you tell it to listen. It will listen 24 hours a day. You can program it to only listen during the dawn chorus, like from 5 a.m. to 9 a.m., or whatever you want it to do. And the idea was, how do we get all of these sound recorders out to the people? And if you haven't, sometimes we put them on, and some of the projects that we do here at SIU, we put them on a tree like this. So it's just in a zip tie inside of this cloth bag. And the cloth bag has no real impact on the recording ability of the sound recorder. It just kind of, helps it blend in a little bit with the woods. So the way we did it, to do this, we said, well, how do we get all these out to them? Well, we had people sign up for the project, or they were, of course, able to host their own sound recorder if they owned one. And we said, great, okay, sign up for a sound recorder. If we have one, we can mail it out to you. You receive it at your house. You read about all the instructions on how to put this out in your yard to get ready for the eclipse. You'll run it and you'll operate it how we tell you, and then you mail it back to us, and then we get gobs and gobs of data. So what we had data collectors do was put the sound recorder out in their listening spot, maybe their backyard, 2 days before the eclipse, during the eclipse, of course, and up to 2 days after. So these sound recorders ran for 5 days straight, all kind of centered on the 2024 total eclipse. And of course, the 2023 annular eclipse. So the 2 days before, it kind of lets us know what's a normal thing, what's a normal sound at your house or your listening location. What does it usually sound like at your house during those days, or at your schoolyard, wherever the sound recorder was? And then how does that differ from what happened on the eclipse? And then those 2 days after the eclipse, of course, do things go back to normal, how they were before the eclipse happened? So we have 5 days to learn about this question of how wildlife are responding. And as I said, these end up back in the mailbox and they come back to ARISA. And then you have gobs and gobs of boxes of sound recorders everywhere. And this is typical, and it looks like a lot, but it's also very, very exciting time because that means that the project is working. The people are deploying the sound recorder, and then they're coming back. And we get to, people like myself, get to learn through the data that you mailed in. And I will let you decide whether this cat is being helpful in this project. Um, I think maybe being helpful. Okay, so we get all these sound recorders. They come back to the mail. We start processing this, and then we say, okay, well, where did all these come from? So if we go back to the 2023 annular eclipse, um, and we go to that map, we can fill in the dots, and we can see that there were about 130 or so total deployments collected for the 2023 annular eclipse. And for the particular analysis that I get to work on, there were 77 deployments that met all of those specific sampling protocols that we needed. We needed those full 2 days before and those 2 days after, and of course during the eclipse. So sometimes the sound recorders would fail for whatever reason it might have been. The sound recorder stopped working, the battery fell out, that type of thing. So I'll point out a couple of important things here just from this map. Just from this map, there are many recordings within the path of the annular eclipse, and there are many recordings outside of the path. So that contrast for me, like a scientist, that's exciting for me because I get to see how wildlife respond differently, whether they're directly within this path or on the outside of this path. And another thing I want to point out is the scale at which the ARISA Lab and the Eclipse Soundscapes project was able to cover, even just in the 2023 annular eclipse. You know, compare it to the Wheeler study that I showed you all right when I started with this talk. That covered the area about the size of that yellow box. And look, there's now many, many states represented in this study, kind of all across the western half of the United States, really up to the Mississippi River, maybe or so, and a little bit beyond, of course. And then if we go and look at the same map for the the 2024 total eclipse, things really picked up. Lots and lots of recordings all along the path of totality, and beyond the path of totality. So another thing I want to point out that I haven't quite mentioned is that my research group here at Southern Illinois University was a data facilitator where we had an ongoing project, a concurrent project called Sounds of Nature that was also collecting data through sound with AudioMoths. So we kind of partnered with Eclipse Soundscapes to help increase coverage in our area where we are. So all of these blue dots right here, I was really excited about, were from our Sounds of Nature project. So if you were one of those Sounds of Nature participants and you're on this call, of course, thank you very, very much. It was great to get data all the way up into Chicago and of course down here in Southern Illinois. But all in all, with the total solar eclipse, there were about 383 deployments collected. 77 of those came from Sounds of Nature. And again, after losing some data, we got about 280 deployments for analysis. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that it resulted in a lot of data. So we had almost 20 terabytes of data, and I will tell you all about terabytes in a minute. But first, I of course want to point out our participant out in Portland, Oregon. Although you were miles and miles from the path of totality, we appreciate your commitment to science because you might have been our farthest from the path of totality, and we need your data point. So thank you, thank you. Okay, back to the terabytes. So between the annular eclipse and the total eclipse, we have about 25 terabytes of sound files. And if you are unfamiliar with this, that's about like 25 hard drives on a personal computer. We have completely filled up 25 personal computers with sound data. And if I can put this in another context, that's almost 46,000 hours of recording just from these two projects. So if I were to tomorrow morning wake up and I put on my headphones and I start listening for 8 hours a day for all of my work days, I just listen and listen and listen. It would take me nearly 16 years for every day of listening 8 hours a day to listen to all of the sound recordings that you all collected. Could you believe that? I promise you, I have no intention of doing that. Like it might be interesting and exciting, but I just can't. I can't do it. So we go about it in a kind of different way. If we want to learn about a particular wildlife group. So It turns out that computers are really, really good at image recognition. They're okay with sound recognition. Image, of course, being a picture. They can recognize pictures. Like if I gave them a bunch of pictures of a dog and a bunch of pictures of a cat, and I told it this was a dog and this was a cat, it would eventually be able to sort new pictures of dogs and cats into the appropriate group. It's really good at picking out pictures. So what we do with all of those sound files is we turn them into pictures. And the pictures, of course, look something like this. I call this a spectrogram. It is an image of sound. And what's cool about this particular spectrogram is I like to study birds. Several of my graduate students here at Southern Illinois University and I work on a lot of birds. So when I look at this picture, I say, oh, that's a prothonotary warbler. And oh, this is a northern parula. This here call is from a cardinal, and this is from a tufted titmouse. So I go and find a bunch of examples of a particular bird that we want to study. And we say, okay, computer, this is what this bird's sound looks like. And I give it bunches of examples, hundreds, thousands of examples of what it looks like. And then I go and give it that 16 years of data. And I say, please go find this picture in all of those sound files. And they'll come back and they'll say, okay, I think I found them. What do you think? And to kind of put it a little bit more formally, this is what it does. So here's a diagram. You see we have a microphone over on the left. So we have our listening device. We pass in the audio data that you all collect and the metadata. Metadata just tells the computer, well, the sound recorder was happening on April 8th in 2024, and it was also happening in Portland, Oregon. So we tell it when it was recording and where it was recording. And from that when and where, it comes up with a plausible species list. It comes up with a list of birds in this case that it thinks might likely be in this location during this month. And then it takes all of that raw sound data and it turns it into a 3-second spectrogram. 3 seconds because the developers of BirdNet, which is an algorithm that does what I'm trying to tell you about, found out that 3 seconds best captures bird song. So it turns it into 3-second spectrograms and it goes and looks for that bird I was looking for. It says, hey, which one of these look like that picture this human just showed me? And it goes through this algorithm that's trained to learn about 6,000 birds. This BirdNet algorithm can identify 6,000 bird species just based on the spectrogram of their song. And it comes back up with its top 3 picks. And it says, okay, it's maybe one of these 3 birds, and here's how confident I am about each of those. So this particular spectrogram that we're looking at here in the gray and black, this is a northern cardinal. So the BirdNet algorithm came back and said, we have are 91% confident this is a cardinal. So it does this process for every 3 seconds of recording that we have. And it does it really, really fast. And it's really, really good at what it does. You know, for being about 6,000 species all over the world, it gets it right about 80% of the time. But sometimes it gets it really wrong. And it puts something like a prairie chicken in downtown Carbondale, Illinois. And I realize there might be dentists on this call, there might be nurses on this call, there might be teachers. And I want to be the first person to tell you, if you're unaware, that a greater prairie chicken should not be in downtown Carbondale. This greater prairie chicken, of course, should be in a prairie. So sometimes BirdNet is wrong, but a lot of the time it's right. And so it's our job to kind of go back through and review the BirdNet results. But BirdNet is a really, really fast way for us to get through those 16 years of sound data that you all recorded. So for every deployment that you all put out there, we get a list of all the possible birds that could have been at your site 2 days before, during, and 2 days after the eclipse. And again, we then go through and vet that list. We say, this is maybe right, this is maybe wrong. And there's even an opportunity for us to go back and listen to the specific 3-second clip and verify it if we needed to. So that's one way to quickly learn about which species are at your site. Another cool way to analyze all of this sound data is something called a soundscape analysis. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but the way soundscape analysis works is that instead of focusing on a single species, like that greater prairie chicken or that northern cardinal, soundscape analysis looks for changes in the sound frequencies during your recording. And it tries to relate that to how many species might be there. So what's kind of cool is that different groups of species vocalize in different frequency bands. So looking at this picture, this is kind of a spectrogram that has a bunch of different groups of species um, on the image. We can see that big insect right there in the middle and that all those bright colors right there in the middle. That's where we're going to typically find a lot of insect populations vocalizing in that particular frequency band. And then down below, we see birds, we see frogs, we see mammals way down below, and even higher frequencies, of course, we get into other insect groups and we get into other bats, or any species like bats. So what soundscape analysis does is it looks at these particular frequency bands, these sound bands, these areas in the soundscape, and it says, well, is there activity in this frequency band, which would maybe indicate that certain species are vocalizing in that frequency band? And it also looks for changes in that frequency band. And it says, well, if it's going up and down a lot, that means one thing. If it's constant, that means another thing. And soundscape analysis is a general, how much biological activity is happening at your site and how much change is there in that biological activity at your site during the eclipse, for example. So we would be able to look at changes in all of these frequencies, but we wouldn't necessarily be able to say which species are changing and which are not. And also, it's a little bit maybe less clear than just saying, oh, there was a cardinal at your site or there wasn't a cardinal at your site. So for the particular preliminary analysis that we've been focused on, we've been explicitly focused on the birds. So we've been using that BirdNet algorithm that I just told you about. So we have not done any soundscape analysis, but this would be an alternative route to analyzing all the cool data that you all collected. So we have some really I think straightforward science questions that we're doing kind of with the preliminary analysis. The first question that we have using the BirdNet algorithm with your recordings is, do birds stop singing during an eclipse or do they keep going? Pretty straightforward. We want to understand how the bird community changed their vocalization pattern during the eclipse. And then if we find that the birds do stop singing during an eclipse or they start singing more, the next question is, well, who gets quiet, which birds get quiet, and which keep singing? And then the last question that we've been focused on, the one I'm particularly excited about, is when do birds start changing their behavior before an eclipse, and how long do the changes last? So that is, if birds do respond to the eclipse, how long before the actual totality do they start changing their vocalization activity? And then after totality, how long does their kind of quiet period last? So and I will show you some results from that question that I'm excited about. But let's start with the very high level question of, do birds stop singing during an eclipse? I want to show you just very briefly how we went about asking this question. So let me remind you, we had the 2 days before, the during, and the 2 days after. And we asked the question, how likely are birds to sing during a 4-minute period? 4 minutes because that's approximately how long totality lasts. And so we went to every one of these daily recordings and we said, okay, let's go to the 4-minute period that would have been occurring when the eclipse happened, but it was 2 days before. And we look at the bird vocalization activity during that 4-minute period. So the peak eclipse is like the center of totality, the max of totality, and the start dotted line is when totality started, and the end is when totality ended. So it's just a 4-minute period 2 days before. But what we did was we went and said, okay, well, let's look at that same exact 4-minute period on every single one of the recording days, and we'll compare that eclipse recording day to the other 4-minute periods to see if there's a difference in the vocalization activity. Okay, so big result is a little bit questionable result. So here on the bottom, on the bottom of this chart, we have a line representing a non-eclipse day, the vocalization activity during no eclipses. In the black line, we have the vocalization events during the eclipse day. And on the up and down, the vertical axis, the y-axis, that's the probability of any given bird vocalize, the chance of a bird vocalizing during that 4-minute period. So if you can see over on the Y, those are really, or over on the vertical axis, those are really small numbers because the probability of a bird vocalizing in Carbondale at 2 p.m. in the afternoon is kind of low. That's kind of a quiet time for birds anyway. But the big result here is that it maybe appears that there is a decrease in vocalization or bird singing during the eclipse, but the yellow line and the black line are still overlapping. They're about half overlapping. So we can't fully say, yes, birds absolutely got quiet during an eclipse. So I kind of think we're here at this, maybe birds stop singing during eclipse, but we need to look a little bit closer because all of those deployments, all of those sound recorders that you all put out occurred all over the place and in very different conditions. Some of you were recording in cities, some of you were recording in forests, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of think that there's a lot of site variation. There's a lot of differences in where you all recorded that can maybe be difficult for us to just ask whether there was a change in vocalization. And then it really matters, I think, a lot about the species. So maybe why we're not seeing a big difference here is because there were so many different responses by each different species, which leads us to the next question. Yes, maybe birds stop singing during an eclipse, but the good question is which birds actually get quiet and which keep singing? So I'm going to show you a very, very small example of a really large plot. And I'm going to first walk through the small example and make sure you all are with me, and then I will show you the big plot. So let's go to our backyard friend, the tufted titmouse. It's a cool little bird. Here's a picture of it if you're unfamiliar with it. And what we can see here is I'm going to show you a bunch of birds. And if they have a yellow bar next to them, that means that there was less bird singing during the eclipse. That means they decreased their singing during the eclipse. And if you see a black bar next to a bird, that means that they increased their singing during the eclipse. So it turns out that this tufted titmouse that I'm showing you right now actually decreases vocalization a lot compared to many other bird species. So this was one of our quietest birds during the eclipse. Okay, so I'm going to show you this next slide is going to show you a bunch of bird species. And just to kind of orient you here, here's our friend the tufted titmouse down here at the bottom of the chart. So we're looking at the same change in vocalization activity across now all these species. So all these species here that you see in yellow, that was a decrease in the chance that they sing during a 4-minute period on the eclipse day. And this includes species like the grackle, the brown-headed cowbird, the red-bellied woodpecker, and the tufted titmouse. They were our top 4 species that changed their vocalization activity the most during the eclipse. And of course, the ones that I'm also excited about, maybe I should be excited about both sides, but I'm a little bit more excited about those who started vocalizing during the eclipse. And I don't know, you probably may not be able to read the species names there, but at the very top, the species that increased their vocalization activity the most was the barred owl. But we also maybe had some surprising species in here. We had American robin, blue jay, white-throated sparrow, the fish crow and the American crow, and the northern cardinal. There's, of course, a couple of other species like the kinglet and the kinglet that I don't have highlighted here, but these species showed some increase in vocalization activity during the eclipse, which was very cool to see. So we have this contrast. So kind of going back to that last slide, do they change vocalization activity? I think yes, but it varies by species in which they do. And when I saw these results, when I was working on this analysis, I said, well, maybe there's some cool family level responses. So, excuse me, here it is. In science, of course, a family is just a group of animals that are closely related, kind of like how we have families with people who are related to each other. So, for example, like cats and tigers belong to the same family because they're closely related, even though they're different animals. Well, we can do the same thing with birds. So instead of showing you all the species here, I'm looking at a family response. So just to give you some context, Strigidae and Corvidae here at the very top, that top family, Strigidae, that is the owl family. And then the Corvidae, of course, are our crow family. So we see that across the species within these family groups, they are kind of responding similarly. Crows were increasing vocalization during the eclipse, and owl species, of course, were also increasing vocalization activity during the eclipse. And that third family down that I don't have highlighted there in the bar, that of course is like the robins. So they were also increasing vocalization activity. And the two families that decreased activity, the decreased activity the most, these were like our chickadees and our tufted titmouse that I showed you, but also the cowbirds, the orioles, the blackbirds, and the grackles. So there seemed to be some pretty consistent group level or family level responses also, which we were really excited to see. So it really is this kind of behavioral response that's a function of the species life history. Okay, so back to this. So it definitely seems like there were some species level responses, but the amount of change in their singing kind of varied across species. And when we did that overall analysis of the yes or no, it just might have not been capturing that species level or that family level variation. Okay, and the last question that we were working on that we were excited about is, when do birds start changing their behavior before totality actually happens? So the timing of the timing of that response, um, I think this question is really where the power of the people comes to play. This analysis could never really be done without the technology that we were using, these sound recorders, or the area that we covered in the study. You know, thinking back to the Wheeler study up in Boston, they were able to say that some species changed their vocalization, but they could never say precisely when it changed. And that's one of these power of the technologies that we're working on here in wildlife science. Okay, so this chart that I'm going to show you is a little bit busy. So I'm walking you through it kind of slowly, and I hope that it makes sense. So to do this, let's see. If I show you over here, this dashed line right here in the middle of the plot is when totality was occurring. We have the maximum totality in the long dashes, and these small dotted are the start of totality and the end of totality. And if you go all the way to the left of the chart, that's when the moon started getting in the way of the sun, just very started, like maybe 1%. And over here at the other end is when it kind of ended. Okay. And then on the vertical axis, the y-axis, we're going to be looking at kind of how frequently birds were vocalizing on every minute during that big, basically 2.5 hour window. Okay. All right, I'm going to show you two lines here. One of the lines is going to be, the yellow line is going to be a non-eclipse day. So one of those two before or two after. And then the black line is going to be when the eclipse occurred. So what we found was you can clearly see on a, well, you can see on a random day, a non-eclipse day, we have pretty consistent vocalization occurring across the eclipse period. On eclipse day, however, we have this clear dip in vocalization activity during totality. And these big nosedives over here, well, this would have been about 5-ish o'clock, maybe here in Carbondale in April, maybe, yeah, probably about 5-ish o'clock. So things were just starting to quiet down anyway. It was starting to go to dusk toward in some places. So this is just evening. It's starting to cool down. So what's the big takeaway? We found that the decrease in vocalization activity happened about 22 minutes before totality. So just like here's the point where we start to see a decrease in vocalization activity. And if you kind of think back, if you were in the path of totality there on April 8th, I remember things really starting to feel different about 20 minutes before totality. So it was also really cool to see the birds responding that way as well. And then the second line is whenever I would say we kind of return to normal. So we have this dip, it comes back to where the vocalization activity was before the eclipse happened. And that was about, you know, give or take 49 minutes after. So it looks like the behavioral response kind of lasted for almost an hour there during the eclipse day compared to a normal day. And again, this last kind of dip in vocalization activity is just as dusk/night and things were quieting down depending on where you were on the path of totality. So this was something that, again, I was really excited about, something that hasn't been quantified before. People haven't been able to say how long these behavioral responses lasted during an eclipse. I'm going to show you the exact same chart, but I'm just going to focus on the nocturnal species and show you some cool plot here that the two owl species that we detected, the barred owl and the great horned owl, during totality, they certainly increased their vocalization activity, but it only happened during eclipse day compared to a non-eclipse day. So there was a clear vocalization response from our nocturnal species, the species that are typically active at night. And what's also pretty cool is if we look at, this black line here is just representing observations within the path of totality. If you look just outside, anywhere outside of path of totality on eclipse day, there was no response at all from the nocturnal species. So this was also a really interesting finding that we had for the nocturnal species about that proximity or how close you were to the center of the path, and how that affected how wildlife respond. So in summary, I kind of want to go back to that 1932 study and bring up a couple more quotes and show how our analysis, our preliminary results are comparing to what they found almost 100 years ago. So here's another quote. Mr. Bailey heard about 10 species of birds, and it was noticeable that as the eclipse progressed, there was a decrease in the song with a silence during totality. And going back to our chart, we certainly found that some species did decrease their vocalization or did stop singing, but a bunch of other species also started singing more during an eclipse. So we had some support for what they found here, but also a little bit different. And I think, again, there are lots of reasons why that might happen. And another thing I want to point out is that now we can also pinpoint with some accuracy when this vocalization activity change started happening, which was certainly something that wasn't being able to be done 90 years ago. I want to show you another report. This is from the zookeeper, Mr. Gregg. Mr. Gregg was a zookeeper. Mr. Gregg reports very little sign of unusual behavior among his birds, but 3 of the 9 great horned owls did become active as if night was coming on. And we certainly totally found a similar response to Mr. Gregg. Our species that are most active at night, the owl species, they certainly increase their vocalization during totality. But we found that they really do need to be within that path to have that behavioral response. And again, another report about the owls from that paper is that several reports of hooting from wilder sections in New Hampshire, and I'd like to think that our great horned owls were also in wilder sections from where you all were sampling. There's one more cool section in the paper, the 1932 study, and it's a section called diurnal land birds inland. So these are these birds that are, terrestrial birds that are active during the day. And I want to point out here is that they report on quieting of blue jays and robins, but blue jays and robins, if you remember back to the slide I showed you, were 2 of our most vocal species during an eclipse. And what I think maybe is going on is that if you think about robins in your yard or robins in your backyard, they're actually pretty well known for their evening and dusk chorus. And they may have perhaps interpreted that change in light as the evening approaching, quickly moving into their evening chorus. And I will say that in that paper, it's often like saying just one report. It says there on the robin, one report, same as for flicker above. Well, this again is illustrating the power of the people. We had deployments all over the place within the path and beyond the path of totality. So I think it's the power of the people that are able, across a really large geographic space, that are able for us to find these species-specific differences or responses that maybe they weren't able to capture in the Wheeler study. We did have pretty consistent responses with some of the species. So there in that section of the paper, they report on the grackles and the house sparrows, and we also found a decrease in the vocalization activity of those species. So there does seem to be some consistent responses to these. They were our 3 quietest families in our analysis, but we're just able to quantify it, or we're able to say how much they've changed vocalization in a way that the Wheeler study couldn't do it. We can pretty precisely say how much do they actually stop compared to an eclipse day. And I guess I'll say that these particular families may rely more on kind of ambient light to regulate their activity, and they might respond to sudden darkness with a very, very quieting of activity, similar to how they would settle in at their nest or their roost at night. So we have a couple more science questions we want to ask. I want to study a little bit more explicitly how close to the path or do you have to be to find this behavioral response? Can you be just at 99% coverage, or do you really have to be at 100% coverage to have that behavioral response? All of the analyses that I was showing you today were focused on the total eclipse, and I want to present some more annular eclipse results here in the near future. And of course, the last thing that I hope we absolutely have time for, because I know there's lots of changes in this vocalization activity, but how do insects and frogs and other species groups change their vocalization activity during the eclipse? So this is certainly on our radar, and we hope to get to it soon. And with that, I am at the end of my slideshow, Mary Kay and Trey, and I apologize if I went a little bit longer than I meant to. I get excited about talking about this stuff, so I will stop sharing my slides, and I suppose we can maybe head over to the Q&A.
Thanks, Brent. That was really great. Definitely appreciate it. We have a few questions, some that we were able to answer. So I'll just out loud say some of those answers and give you a second to drink your water while I say those out loud. Someone asked about if we are sharing this data publicly and freely, so people might be able to access their data. And so I did want to share with people that we are. We're sharing the data via Zenodo, which is open, it's free, and it takes a while to get all these sites up there, so they're not all up there yet. And so we're making that happen throughout 2025, and you can get to the Eclipse Soundscapes community on Zenodo on the eclipsesoundscapes.org website. So wanted to share that because that's important information. And then there's a few questions. I'll ask some out loud, and then I know some people have their hands up, so we'll also make that happen. So someone asked, David asked, is there a reason that the eclipse day vocalizations per minute started lower on the first slide?
I think maybe David's asking about the black line versus the yellow line chart.
Yes, I think that's correct.
And
The yellow lines, or sorry, the black lines started far lower than the yellow line, even before that line that you drew.
oh, let me go to
when the effect took place.
the timing
Timings.
result.
The
The
timing
timing
results,
result.
yep.
Oh, that's an
Yes,
interesting
that's
question. Okay,
correct.
so
And I wanted to mention too, I just unmuted David so he could add clarified elements.
That was totally correct. Thanks.
okay.
The slide, the yellow versus the black lines, it was about 2 or 4 points lower.
That's a great question. So David was observing whenever I was showing you how the timing of the eclipse happened, the response to that, how on eclipse day, there was kind of on average just less vocalization happening during that approximately 2.5 hour period compared to a non-eclipse day. Several things that could have been going on there, David. Of course, if you were in the path of totality, or if you, wherever you were on that day, it doesn't really, you don't really start to feel a change when there's 1% coverage, for example. It really takes a while for there to be a lot of coverage before there starts to have changes in feelings, at least for me during that day. So there can be several things that contribute to this. There's a lot of research out there that show how the importance of cloud cover or temperature or precipitation at those particular sampling locations might have affected or might affect bird vocalization activity even without an eclipse. So my guess is that there could have just been something like that going on. There could have just been a quieter day for some absolute random reason, even though it is pretty consistent on the eclipse day versus that non-eclipse day. Maybe there was something particularly great about that non-eclipse day that the birds really wanted to just sing out loud all the time. But there's no real reason that I can say without doing a further analysis of why there was overall less vocalization on eclipse day versus that random non-eclipse day. There's a lot of factors that kind of go into the frequency of vocalization.
And
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. This is Trey jumping in. I just wanted to say that there is research going on how eclipses actually affect temperatures in different ranges and what time frame that takes place. And also it's shown that eclipses can affect cloud cover as well. But disentangling all those multiple variables is not something that I really want to do, because those are just far too complicated to disentangle.
That's my follow-up. So thanks so much.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for the question, David. It's definitely an interesting one. I wish I had a little bit more to tell you about it, but there's several things that go into general bird vocalization activity on a daily basis.
So I will ask another question that we have in the chat. I'm actually going to drop down one, but then I'll come back to one that was sooner because I think this one might be a quick one from Mary. It makes sense that owls get more vocal at night because they're nocturnal. But how do crows generally react at night? Do they get more vocal?
They are certainly vocal kind of during these dusk periods, these evening periods before we go into night. So that's kind of honest. I mean, that's more what it felt like, right? It didn't feel like it was pitch black outside. It was very, very big changes in light. So I'm thinking that they kind of thought they lost track of the day and we were starting to go into the evening and they started off with their kind of vocalization activity. But no, I don't typically hear crows when when it's pitch black outside. I will say kind of anecdotally, around the time of the eclipse last year, I received a photo in my inbox of this really, really awesome picture of the eclipse and it had a bird passing in front of it, just like a total accident. They didn't mean to snap. I just snapped their photo and there happened to be a bird in the image. And after chatting with a few ornithologists, we came to the conclusion that it was a crow that was flying across the front of the moon, or front of the sun, on that eclipse day. So that was pretty cool.
All right. I will ask another question. So I'm actually going to read the questions out, but then I'll see if Richard wants to add any clarification questions. So I do have one question from Richard. Sorry, I lost it in my screen. And I believe the question is, how does the brief darkness during an eclipse compare to a sudden 4-minute period of heavy cloud cover in terms of its impact on multiple species and the resulting soundscape? And I'm going to unmute Richard because he also had one other question and make sure that in case he has clarification questions after you answer that.
I can't tell you with precision. I feel like that, and I don't mean to put it on Trey. Like Trey might be able to precisely tell you how much change there is in light during these like cloudy days versus an eclipse day. But as a wildlife biologist, I have not fully studied that. But it's a great question to ask how the birds respond on cloudy days versus what this eclipse day event happened. You know, I guess I can't really get into it. I don't have any, I really am hesitant to even answer because I don't have data to support anything I would say, but it would just be all anecdotally about my experience during the eclipse versus how I experience when a cloud moves in front of the sun on a otherwise sunny day. Mary Kay did just link in the GLOBE program that I think has a lot of weather data that was also being recorded during the eclipse. And I'm thinking that that's maybe an area where folks are working on and thinking about this question. But tell me, Mary Kay, was I right about that link?
You are. So the GLOBE program and GLOBE Eclipse specifically was also a participatory science project and also NASA science activation. And we did a lot of co-presentations with them. So many people here might have participated in both. And people who participated in that collected temperature data throughout the whole eclipse. And they're very interested in cloud coverage and temperature data. Now, they're not specifically looking at, to my knowledge, how that impacts wildlife. But if you're interested in eclipses and cloud coverage and temperature, it would be great to check that out.
And if you want to do your own science, they've got all their locations and we've got all our locations publicly available. So you can do your own analysis about how cloud cover affects wildlife on the days before and after the eclipse.
Very cool. It looks like there was even a paper linked in here, Mary Kay, that looks like maybe talking about the globe clouds team. Very cool. So it looks like folks are on this question. People are studying this, and I fortunately or unfortunately am just stuck with the birds.
Let me check now to see what other questions we have here. And yes, you're right, Kristen Weaver, who is from the GLOBE program, as you mentioned, shared some information. And then I also dropped that in the chat. So that's very helpful. So we have another question. I'm going to answer part of it, but then you'll probably get the other side. So it's a question from Brandy, and this person mentioned were there any species that were more challenging to find recordings of due to not as many humans living in more rural areas, making it challenging to get multiple days of data? So I'm going to answer the back half of that, in that even if there were a lot of people there, we were still able to get the multiple days of data. However, was it difficult for you, Brent, to find birds mixed in with those people? So I'll throw that to you.
Yeah, I think it's a really cool question, and it thinks a lot about I think a lot about participatory sciences, or the science together, where we're really good at sampling a lot of different types of areas. Like we sample forests a lot and we sample cities a lot, but there are places like particularly rural areas or even grasslands that are typically undersampled in these studies. So we probably did miss some species responses and some general ecosystems that we don't have in this study. Um, and then there's also just species typical like vocalization activity or vocalization patterns that are sometimes really difficult for BirdNet. There's this state threatened species called a blue-winged warbler here in Illinois, and BirdNet just really doesn't do a great job with that species. Its call is kind of buzzy, and it often is confused with other species, or sometimes just even misses its detection. So there are species that we probably poorly sampled, but the good news is with hundreds of deployments and hundreds of species in the data set, we can kind of still get at these general trends, even if we are missing some very specific species responses. So yes, some species are more difficult in rural areas because, or in general, some areas because we undersample them, and then some species are difficult because of the way they vocalize.
Okay, and we have another question from Richard.
Mm.
And I think there's a typo in part of it, so I'm going to do my best, but Richard might have to clarify something. Richard wants to know, how does causality correlation weigh in?
I think it's like causality versus correlation. So we're seeing these correlated results. We're seeing changes in bird vocalization that happen to be during that totality period. How are we sure that it's the eclipse that's causing these changes in vocalization and not something else? Richard, that's a great point. I'll kind of piggyback on my previous question. Well, let me first say that I do always instruct my undergraduate students here at SIU to not to jump to conclusions when we find some interesting results. But kind of piggybacking on that last question about the rural areas, we have a lot of data here, Richard, hundreds of thousands of bird detections over that 5-day period across all of these sampling locations. And while if we had just a few outliers, if I just said, well, we had one detection of a American robin that occurred and it wasn't during the eclipse, and therefore American robins avoid the eclipse, I wouldn't have a lot of ground to stand on. But we have really thousands of detections of American robin, and we have a timestamp associated with all those vocalizations. So we have a little bit more confidence in saying that, well, maybe if it happened and we compared it to these 4 other non-eclipse days, and there is a change in the signal or a change in how often that bird is singing during that particular 4-minute period on eclipse day, like it could be clouds, it could be something odd about those sampling locations, but we have such an incredible data set that you all collected, that we feel a little bit more confident about making some of these statements about changes in bird vocalization activity.
Yeah, and I'll say that that's one of the reasons that we chose to do this as a participatory science project. We knew that we would need the great coverage that we got in order to say anything. And there's just no way even a large team, let alone a small team, could actually do that. So we used the power of just the public and people being interested in science to do something that scientists themselves could not have done alone. And that, I think, is very exciting.
I agree.
So I want to ask a question to Brent real quick because it was partially answered. And that question was, what resources can people go to if they want to learn more about how to do soundscape analysis? And I directed them to the BirdNet website because not only did I learn how to implement BirdNet in Python in a very short amount of time, but they have a mobile app and you can even upload samples to their website for analysis. So I thought maybe you might have some more for people who might be interested in doing this either as a hobby or getting more in depth with it.
Yeah, so I'll say 2 things on top of BirdNet. Many of you that are on this call may even have an app on your phone called Merlin. and Merlin has a very similar thing. The underlying algorithm under these apps is something called a convolutional neural net. Well, BirdNet and Merlin are slightly different. They have different underlying algorithms, but they're both trying to do the same thing. They're both are trying to ID species. So if you have Merlin on your phone, that's a start where you can just start to learn about the birds in your backyard. And you can go out during a cloudy day, and you can go out during a sunny day, and you can make those comparisons yourself and think about how the weather at your local site affects birds. So Trey is right in that BirdNet is fantastic. Merlin's fantastic to be able to do a soundscape analysis. How can you turn sound into learning about these species IDs? I will also direct you to a platform called Bird Weather. Bird Weather is a global library of bird vocalizations. And the way that Bird Weather works is it is a 24/7 platform for recording bird sound in your backyard and identifying the species right as the sound comes in. And together there are thousands and thousands of listening locations all across the world. And you can contribute to a larger project for researchers like myself to go in and learn about global changes in bird activity through those platforms. Those are 3 relatively accessible ways to go about it. There was also just a link in for AudioMoth, and AudioMoth is, relatively speaking, a low-cost, inexpensive sound recorder. So if you wanted to do more of these long-term deployments, you could get an AudioMoth, and you could totally do this in your backyard and not rely on your phone. And then you go say, I only want to listen to the birds during the dawn chorus. So you record for 4 hours in the morning, you bring that sound file back in, you take it over to the BirdNet algorithm, like Trey said, and then you start to go through and verify, and it says, oh yeah, now I see how he talked about there being a prairie chicken in downtown Carbondale. And there'll be some odd species that get reported, but you're going to be totally impressed to see that it's really pretty accurate. So lots of ways to listen to the birds in your backyard. Just on your own.
And I'll also throw in that all of these are available on the Eclipse Soundscapes website. So we actually have a tab on the Eclipse Soundscapes website for the AudioMoth. And it does have a link to open acoustic devices, which gives you all the information for the AudioMoth. And it also has a cool link where the open acoustic devices did a whole roundup of all of the freely available data analysis tools that are out there for different ways to utilize some of these this data. So you can check that out there too. And then we'll also add what Brent recommended, Merlin, as well as Bird Weather. So we'll add those 2 sites. So all of those are there, as well as several other free and user-made sites from people who like to use AudioMoths. And many of you have AudioMoths if you were a data collector.
Yeah, and evidently Richard Moser likes Kaleidoscope, which I've heard
very
of,
cool.
but I've not used.
Kaleidoscope's a really nice platform for processing those sound files. It'll read in the sound files, and it'll also read in your BirdNet output. You can just click through very nicely and say, oh yeah, that was a northern cardinal, or oh yeah, that was this bird. So it's a very, very nice software. Yeah.
Do we want to answer?
Okay.
So Dana Roberts has their hand raised.
Sure. I'll grab it in 1 second. I was just going to read out loud Eric's question. So any word on whether there will be a bird net for insects and amphibians someday soon?
I wish it was so easy. There are a few like very small scale, very small research groups who have developed their own version of that. Own version of BirdNet for insects or for amphibians, mostly frogs species, of course. But no, it doesn't. BirdNet is not trained on those yet all the way. BirdNet can detect some insects, like a few cricket species, and BirdNet can also detect mammals. And BirdNet can also detect humans. So it can detect power tools, it can detect engines, and can detect human voice. But I would not say it is a ready to go, all the amphibians and all the insects, but it is starting to work towards that. And I wonder if they'll eventually maybe go through a name change, or maybe have something called FrogNet or InsectNet or something. I'm not sure what they'll do, but they are working on multiple species groups.
Okay, and I also just made it so that Dana, who has their hand raised, can ask their question. So Dana, If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question out loud, please let us know your thoughts. Looks like you're unmuted, Dana, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to thank everyone for allowing Ralph and I to be a part of all of this. It was absolutely magnificent sitting out in the yard, looking up at the sky and seeing what we saw. It was just breathtaking. Also, we will always be AudioMoth number 379. Thank you so much for giving us this honor. And I'm so glad that you are part of this because it's what the world is all about. I want you guys to take care of yourself, and I will see you in the future.
Oh, thank you, Dana. That's amazing.
You know, that's one of the reasons why we do this. It's not, there really isn't that big money in doing participatory science or this type of research, but that meaning that we get from it, and it gives me joy to know that other people do as well. Because I chose this as a career. Not everybody did, and the fact that other people like it too, it's always very cool to me, and it keeps me going.
Well, that might be a good note to end on, because we don't have any more questions queued up, and I don't think we have any more hands raised. So please continue to follow the eclipsesoundscapes.org website. We try to put updates there as often as possible. You can also find links to the Zenodo community, which is again where all of that audio data is going to go for free. We have a blog post that is about a lot of this information that Brent shared with us today. We're also going to have this recording on the website. And then many of the sites that we mentioned today that you can utilize for analysis are there, and any new ones that got added, we will go ahead and make sure to get those up onto the Eclipse Soundscapes website too. We don't want you to have to remember all these different sites to go to. Ideally, you can just go to eclipsesoundscapes.org and find all of the things that you need. And then if you can't find what you need, you can always email us from the site or info@eclipsesoundscapes.org. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brent, for an amazing presentation. It was really great. And I guess with that, we'll leave everyone to the rest of their afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett, and thank you, everybody.